The dust-laden wind whistled through the cracks of Tabitha Winters' dilapidated cabin as she scrubbed the floorboards raw, her knuckles bleeding from hours of work. Folks in Redemption Creek, Colorado, said many things about Tabitha: that she was wild as the untamed stallions roaming the plains, that she was common as dirt, that no decent man would ever take her as his wife, but no one could ever claim she didn't work herself to the bone. It was 1876, and the promise of a new life in the West had drawn many to these rugged lands. For Tabitha, 22 years old with fiery copper hair and a reputation that preceded her like thunderclouds before a storm, the West wasn't a promise, but an escape. 5 years ago, she'd fled the Pennsylvania orphanage where she'd grown up, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and a tarnished locket containing a faded photograph of the mother she barely remembered. Filthy as sin, Mrs. Hempstead had called her when she'd seen Tabitha pass by the general store yesterday. The woman's voice had carried deliberately across the street. That Winters girl couldn't be clean if she bathed in lye soap for a month. No wonder she can't find herself a husband. Tabitha pushed herself to her feet, her back aching from the hours spent on her hands and knees. Through the small window, she could see the sprawling ranch that bordered her modest property. The Circle H Ranch, owned by the Henderson family, was the largest in the county, employing a dozen cowboys and boasting the finest cattle for miles around. As if summoned by her thoughts, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, cutting a striking silhouette against the setting sun. Even from a distance, Tabitha recognized the broad shoulders and confident posture of Henry Henderson, the ranch owner's eldest son. At 28, Henry had returned from the war a decorated hero, only to find his father ailing and the ranch in need of a strong hand. In the 3 years since, he'd turned the Circle H into the most prosperous operation in the territory. Unlike the other eligible men in town, Henry had never joined in the gossip about Tabitha. If anything, she'd caught him watching her with something like curiosity in his deep-set eyes when she made her infrequent trips into town for supplies. Tabitha grabbed her threadbare shawl and stepped onto the porch as Henry approached. The setting sun cast long shadows across her small property, painting everything in hues of amber and gold. "Evening, Miss Winters," Henry called, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and measured, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. "Mr. Henderson," she replied cautiously. "What brings you to my door at this hour?" Henry dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes from squinting in the harsh sun, the weathered tan of his skin, the slight curl of his dark hair where it escaped his hat. "One of your goats broke through the fence again. Found her grazing with my cattle." His expression remained neutral, but Tabitha could detect no anger in his tone. "I apologize," she said stiffly, her pride stinging. "I've been meaning to reinforce that section of fence." Henry nodded, his gaze taking in the small homestead, the vegetable garden struggling against the summer heat, the chicken coop she'd built herself, the stack of wood she'd chopped for the coming winter. His eyes lingered on her bleeding knuckles before returning to her face. "I could send one of my men over tomorrow to help with that fence," he offered. Tabitha lifted her chin. "I can manage my own repairs, Mr. Henderson." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I never doubted that, Miss Winters. But even the strongest among us can use a helping hand now and then." Before she could formulate a response, he was reaching into his saddlebag. "Nearly forgot. Your goat." He pulled out a small, bleeding kid and handed it to her. Tabitha accepted the animal, surprised by the unexpected weight. "Thank you for bringing her back." Henry mounted his horse with the same fluid motion. "Think on my offer about the fence," he said, settling into the saddle. "Good evening, Miss Winters." With a tip of his hat, he turned his mount and rode back toward the Circle H, leaving Tabitha standing on her porch with the wayward goat in her arms and an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the summer heat already building as Tabitha fed her animals. She worked methodically, her mind drifting to Henry Henderson's unexpected visit. In the 3 years she'd lived in her little cabin on the edge of town, this was the first time he'd come calling, though she'd seen him from afar many times. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Shielding her eyes against the morning sun, she saw not one but 3 riders approaching Henry Henderson, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands, all carrying tools and lumber. "Told you I'd send help for that fence," Henry called as they drew near. Tabitha crossed her arms. "And I told you I could manage." Henry dismounted, his expression serious. "Miss Winters, I've got 30 head of cattle grazing near that shared fence line. It's in my interest as much as yours to have it properly repaired." His logic was sound, and Tabitha reluctantly nodded. "Very well." The men set to work, and despite her initial reservations, Tabitha worked alongside them, hammering posts and stretching wire. By midday, sweat soaked through her simple cotton dress, and her hair had escaped its pins to curl wildly around her face. "You work harder than most men I know," Henry commented, passing her the canteen. Tabitha took a careful sip of water. "Necessity is an effective teacher, Mr. Henderson." "Henry," he corrected. "If we're to be neighbors mending fences together, you might as well use my given name." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Tabitha, then." They worked through the afternoon, and by the time the sun began its descent, the fence stood sturdy and tall, a proper barrier between their properties. "I appreciate the help," Tabitha said as the men packed up their tools. Henry lingered after sending his ranch hands ahead. "I was wondering," he said, his usual confidence seeming to waver, "if you might join my family for dinner this Sunday after church." Tabitha stiffened. "I don't attend church, Mr. Henderson." "Henry," he reminded her gently, "and dinner stands regardless of church attendance." Tabitha thought of the Henderson home, the largest house in the county, filled with fine furnishings and proper people who whispered behind their hands when she passed. "I don't think that would be appropriate." Henry's brow furrowed. "Why not?" "You know why," she said, her voice tight. "The people in town shouldn't dictate who sits at my family's table," Henry interrupted. "My mother makes a roast on Sundays that would make the angels weep." 6 o'clock. Before she could formulate another refusal, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Tabitha staring after him with a mixture of confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Tabitha spent the morning tending her garden and steadfastly ignoring the invitation to the Henderson home. By 5 o'clock, however, she found herself drawing a bath, scrubbing her skin until it glowed pink and washing her copper hair until it shone. She put on her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days but was clean and mended, and pinned her hair in a modest style. The walk to the Henderson ranch took 20 minutes. With each step, Tabitha considered turning back, but something propelled her forward, perhaps curiosity, perhaps loneliness, perhaps the memory of Henry's smile when he'd corrected her use of his surname. The Henderson home loomed large and imposing as she approached. Built of sturdy timber, with a wide porch wrapping around its perimeter, it spoke of prosperity and permanence. Tabitha hesitated at the foot of the steps, her courage faltering. The door opened before she could retreat, and Henry stood framed in the doorway. He'd traded his work clothes for clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his dark hair still damp from washing. "You came," he said, and the simple pleasure in his voice steadied her nerves. "I was promised a roast that would make angels weep," she replied, a tempting lightness. Henry's smile widened. "My mother never disappoints." He led her inside, where the aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. The interior was comfortable rather than ostentatious, with well-worn furniture and family photographs adorning the walls. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was a small woman with Henry's dark hair, now streaked with silver, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Miss Winters, welcome to our home," she said warmly, taking Tabitha's hands in her own. "Henry's told us so much about you." "Has he?" Tabitha asked, shooting Henry a questioning glance. "All good things," Mrs. Henderson assured her. "He says you've made quite a success of your little homestead, all on your own. That takes grit." Before Tabitha could respond, the dining room door opened, and an older man appeared, leaning heavily on a cane. Mr. Henderson's once powerful frame was now bent with age and illness, but his eyes, so like his son's, were sharp and assessing. "So this is the girl who's been occupying my son's thoughts," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Pa," Henry warned, but there was no heat in it. Dinner proved to be less intimidating than Tabitha had feared. The Hendersons asked about her homestead, her animals, her garden, treating her work with respect rather than the disdain she'd come to expect from the townspeople. By the time Mrs. Henderson served apple pie for dessert, Tabitha found herself relaxing, even laughing at Mr. Henderson's tales of the early days of ranching in the territory. "Henry tells me you came west on your own," Mrs. Henderson said as they sipped coffee after the meal. "That must have taken considerable courage." Tabitha hesitated, and used to discussing her past. "I didn't have much to leave behind," she admitted. "And the West seemed to offer possibilities." "Has it?" Henry asked quietly. "Offered what you hoped for?" Tabitha met his gaze. "I have land of my own, animals that depend on me, food I've grown with my own hands." "Yes, it has." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Independence is a fine thing, but community matters too. I hope you'll join us again, Miss Winters." "Tabitha, please," she said, surprising herself. The walk home beneath a canopy of stars was made less solitary by Henry's insistence on escorting her. They moved in companionable silence until they reached her cabin. "Thank you," Tabitha said, pausing at her door. "Your family is very kind." "They liked you," Henry replied. "My father especially. He appreciates people who forge their own path." Tabitha smiled faintly. "Even when that path leads to a reputation like mine?" Henry's expression grew serious. "Especially then. Good night, Tabitha." In the days that followed, Tabitha found herself watching for Henry's tall figure on the horizon more often than she cared to admit. He appeared regularly, sometimes with practical reasons, bringing a tool she might need or offering advice on her struggling corn crop, and sometimes with no reason at all beyond checking that she was faring well. The townsfolk noticed. Whispers followed Tabitha when she ventured into Redemption Creek for supplies, harsher than before. She set her cap for Henry Henderson. Mrs. Hempstead told the milliner loudly enough for Tabitha to hear as she selected seeds at the general store. As if a man like that would look twice at dirt like her. Tabitha's cheeks burned, but she held her head high as she paid for her purchases. Outside, she nearly collided with Henry himself, who steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Careful there," he said, his smile fading as he noted her expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Tabitha replied quickly, attempting to step around him. Henry frowned, glancing toward the store where Mrs. Hempstead stood watching through the window. "What did they say to you?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," Tabitha said, her voice tight. "I should get back. The chickens need feeding." Henry's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "I'll ride out later to check on that well pump. I think it might need replacing before winter." Tabitha nearly refused his help but found she couldn't bear to. Instead, she nodded and hurried away, the weight of the town's judgment heavy on her shoulders. Henry arrived as promised that afternoon, tools in hand. He worked on the well pump while Tabitha tended her garden, the silence between them uncharacteristically strained. "You shouldn't come around so often," Tabitha finally said as the sun began to set. "People talk." Henry straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Let them." "It's easy for you to say that," Tabitha replied, her frustration building. "You're Henry Henderson. I'm just the dirty orphan girl who doesn't know her place. Henry's expression darkened. Is that what they called you? Among other things. Tabitha turned away, blinking back unexpected tears. I've managed on my own this long. I don't need your charity or your pity. Is that what you think this is? Henry asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Charity. When Tabitha didn't answer, he crossed to her in 3 long strides, gently turning her to face him. Look at me, Tabitha. She raised her eyes reluctantly, unprepared for the intensity in his gaze. I admire you, he said simply. Your strength, your determination, the way you face each day on your own terms. That's not charity or pity. That's respect. Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. The town will never accept me, especially not as. As what? Henry prompted when she fell silent. As someone worthy of your attention, she finished, barely above a whisper. Henry's hand came up to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Then perhaps it's time they learned to see you as I do. Before Tabitha could respond, he was bending toward her, his intention clear. She had a moment to decide to step away or to meet him halfway. Her heart pounding, she chose the latter. His lips were warm against hers, the kiss tentative at first, then growing in confidence when she didn't pull away. Tabitha had been kissed before fumbling, hurried embraces with boys who saw her as easy prey due to her lack of family protection. This was different. Henry kissed her as if she were precious, as if he had all the time in the world to learn the shape of her mouth against his. When they finally parted, Tabitha's cheeks were flushed, her breathing unsteady. That was overdue, Henry finished, his voice rough. He stepped back, though his eyes never left her face. I should go, but I'll be back tomorrow if you'll allow it. Tabitha nodded, unable to form words. Henry smiled, squeezed her hand once, and departed, leaving her standing by the well with her fingers pressed to her lips. True to his word, Henry returned the next day and the next. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh bread from his mother's kitchen, a length of sturdy fabric for new curtains. Always, he treated her with a gentle respect that slowly began to mend the parts of Tabitha's heart that had been wounded by years of cruel words and colder stares. Summer gave way to autumn, and the prairie grasses turned golden beneath an endless blue sky. Tabitha's garden yielded a modest harvest, which she preserved for the winter months ahead. Henry helped her repair the roof of her cabin and her small barn, ensuring both would withstand the snow that would eventually blanket the land. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of fire, Henry took her hand in his. There's a harvest dance in town next weekend, he said. Would you accompany me? Tabitha stiffened. Their relationship, whatever it was, had existed in the safe confines of her homestead and occasionally his family's ranch. To appear together publicly, at a social event no less, would be to invite scrutiny she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. Henry, she began carefully, you know how people talk. Let them talk, he said firmly. I'm tired of hiding what I feel for you. Tabitha's heart stuttered. And what is it that you feel? Henry turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. I love you, Tabitha Winters. I think I have since the moment I saw you standing in town, had held high despite every whisper aimed your way. You're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known, and I'd be proud to have you on my arm at the dance and every day thereafter if you'll have me. Tabitha stared at him, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finding none, she squeezed his hand. Even if the entire town disapproves? Especially then, Henry replied with a smile that warmed her from within. So, will you come with me? Tabitha took a deep breath. Yes. The week leading up to the harvest dance passed in a blur of nerves and preparation. Mrs. Henderson invited Tabitha to the ranch, where she produced a beautiful dress of deep green velvet from her own younger days. With careful alterations, it fit Tabitha as if made for her, the rich color complementing her copper hair and fair skin. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Henderson said as Tabitha stood before the mirror. "Henry won't be able to take his eyes off you." "It's not Henry's eyes I'm worried about," Tabitha admitted. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "People can be cruel, especially to those they don't understand. But you hold your head high. You've nothing to be ashamed of." The night of the dance arrived clear and cool. Henry appeared at Tabitha's door in his finest clothes, his normally unruly hair tamed, and his boots polished to a shine. The look in his eyes when he saw her in the green velvet dress was worth every moment of anxiety that had preceded it. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The town hall was decorated with autumn leaves and harvest bounty, lanterns casting a warm glow over the gathering. As Henry and Tabitha entered, a momentary hush fell over the crowd, followed by a swell of whispers. Tabitha felt her courage faltering, but Henry's hand at the small of her back steadied her. Mrs. Hempstead stood with a group of town matrons, her disapproving gaze following them across the room. The blacksmith's wife turned deliberately away. Several young women who had set their caps for Henry over the years stared openly, their expressions ranging from shock to outrage. "Henry," Tabitha whispered, "perhaps this was a mistake." "The only mistake would be letting them dictate our happiness," Henry replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "May I have this dance, Miss Winters?" Before she could respond, he was leading her onto the dance floor, pulling her into his arms as the musicians struck up a lively tune. Tabitha had learned to dance at the orphanage, though opportunities to practice had been rare. Still, Henry led confidently, and soon she found herself relaxing into the movement, even smiling as he twirled her beneath the lantern light. One dance became two, then three. As the evening progressed, a few of the more open-minded townspeople approached them: the doctor and his wife, the schoolteacher, the young couple who ran the town's small newspaper. By the time they paused for refreshments, Tabitha's initial fear had receded somewhat, replaced by cautious enjoyment. "See," Henry murmured as he handed her a cup of punch. Not everyone shares Mrs. Hempstead's narrow view of the world. As if summoned by her name, the woman herself approached, flanked by two other town matrons. Their expressions suggested they weren't coming to extend a welcome. "Henry Henderson," Mrs. Hempstead said, her voice carrying. "Your dear mother must be beside herself with worry to see you fraternizing this way." Henry's posture stiffened, though his voice remained even. "My mother is quite fond of Miss Winters, actually. She helped alter that very dress Tabitha is wearing." Mrs. Hempstead's eyes narrowed. "Well, I suppose even the finest fabric can't disguise what lies beneath. Some stains run too deep for soap and water to touch." Tabitha felt the words like a physical blow, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She started to step back, to retreat, but Henry's hand caught hers, holding her in place. "Mrs. Hempstead," he said, his tone deceptively mild, "have you ever wondered why Miss Winters keeps to herself? Why she rarely comes to town? It's because of people like you, who judge without knowing, who condemn without understanding." The woman's mouth opened in indignation, but Henry continued, his voice gaining strength. "Tabitha Winters arrived in this town 3 years ago with nothing but her own determination and work ethic. She's built a life from scratch, a homestead that produces more per acre than most in the county, animals that thrive under her care, a home she maintains with more diligence than many who claim superior standing." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Tabitha wanted to sink into the floor, but Henry's hand in hers kept her anchored. "As for cleanliness," Henry continued, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Hempstead's reddening face, "I've never met anyone who works harder or cares more for what's genuinely important." If that's not good enough for Redemption Creek's so-called society, then perhaps it's society that needs cleansing, not Tabitha. Mrs. Hempstead sputtered. Well, No, you never have, Henry agreed, his voice suddenly gentle. You've never taken the time to know her. But I have. And I count myself fortunate for it. With that, he turned to Tabitha, whose eyes had filled with tears despite her best efforts. Would you like to go? We can leave if you wish. Tabitha looked around at the gathered crowd, some hostile, some curious, a few openly supportive. For the first time, she realized that not everyone in town shared Mrs. Hempstead's opinion. The doctor's wife was nodding in approval. The schoolteacher offered a small smile of encouragement. Drawing a deep breath, Tabitha straightened her shoulders. Actually, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, I believe you promised me another dance. A slow smile spread across Henry's face, pride evident in his eyes. So I did. As he led her back to the dance floor, Tabitha felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and defiance that had defined her for so long. Henry's defense of her character, offered publicly and without reservation, had altered something fundamental in the way she saw herself. They danced until the musicians packed away their instruments and the lanterns burned low. By the time Henry escorted her home beneath a canopy of stars, Tabitha felt lighter than she had in years, despite the confrontation. I've never had anyone stand up for me like that, she said as they approached her cabin. Henry's arm tightened around her waist. Get used to it. I plan to stand beside you for as long as you'll let me. Tabitha stopped, turning to face him in the moonlight. Why? Why me, when you could have any woman in the county? Women with respectable backgrounds and dowries, and Henry silenced her with a kiss, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. Because none of them are you, he said when they parted. None of them have your courage or your heart. None of them make me feel the way you do, like the world is full of possibilities, like every day is an adventure worth waking up for. Tabitha's breath caught at the raw emotion in his voice. Henry. I meant what I said earlier, he continued. I love you, Tabitha Winters. And if you'll have me, I want to spend my life showing you just how much. In that moment, beneath the vast Colorado sky, Tabitha allowed herself to believe in the impossible, that she, the orphan girl with dirt under her nails and a reputation for wildness, could find happiness with this man who saw beyond the labels the world had placed upon her. I love you too, she whispered, the words unfamiliar but true. Henry's answering smile could have lit the prairie for miles around. The weeks following the harvest dance brought changes to Tabitha's life that she could scarcely have imagined. Though some in town still whispered behind their hands when she passed, others, emboldened by Henry's public defense, began to acknowledge her with nods or even greetings. The doctor's wife invited her to join a quilting circle. The newspaper editor asked if she might share some of her gardening knowledge for a series of articles on homesteading. Most surprising of all was the gradual shift in how Tabitha saw herself. Years of being labeled as wild and dirty had seeped into her own perception, making her believe she was somehow less worthy than others. Henry's unwavering belief in her began to erode that conviction, replacing it with something that felt dangerously like self-respect. As winter approached, Henry spent increasingly more time at Tabitha's homestead, helping her prepare for the harsh months ahead. They worked side by side, cutting wood, smoking meat, preserving the last of the garden's bounty. In the evenings, they sat before her small fireplace, reading aloud or simply talking, their voices soft in the gathering darkness. On the first snow of the season, Henry arrived with his sleigh, bundled against the cold. Get your coat, he said, his eyes dancing with excitement. I have something to show you. Curious, Tabitha wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and climbed into the sleigh beside him. They traveled across snow-covered fields, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air, until they reached a rise overlooking both their properties, the sprawling Circle H Ranch and Tabitha's modest homestead. Henry helped her from the sleigh and led her to a flat boulder, brushing away the snow so they could sit. From their vantage point, the land stretched out before them, pristine and beautiful in its winter mantle. "My grandfather settled this land when there was nothing here but prairie grass and promise," Henry said, his voice soft with reverence. "He built the first cabin with his own hands, raised the first cattle, dug the first well. My father expanded what his father began, turning a homestead into a ranch that could support a family through good years and bad." Tabitha listened, drawn in by the pride and history in his voice. "I always knew I'd continue their legacy," Henry continued. "What I didn't know was that I'd find someone who understands what this land means not just as property, but as a living thing that responds to care and hard work." He turned to face her, taking her gloved hands in his. "Tabitha, our properties share a boundary, but they could share much more. They could be one." Tabitha's heart began to race as his meaning became clear. "Henry." He slid from the boulder to one knee in the snow, still holding her hands. "I'm not proposing we combine deed lines, though that could be arranged if you wish. I'm proposing we combine our lives. Will you marry me, Tabitha Winters? Will you build a future with me on this land we both love?" Tears sprang to Tabitha's eyes, crystallizing in the cold. "People will talk," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "Let them," Henry replied with a smile. "They'll have plenty to say when Henry Henderson marries the woman they called too dirty for a bride. But I'll put a ring on your finger with pride, because I know the truth of who you are." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, not an ostentatious diamond, but a simple gold band set with a small, perfect pearl. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother gave it to me last week. She said it belonged on the hand of a woman who knows the value of hard work and love in equal measure." Tabitha stared at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her in the snow, his eyes full of a future she'd never dared to imagine for herself. In that moment, she made her choice not just to accept his proposal, but to accept that she was worthy of it. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear in the winter stillness. "Yes, I'll marry you, Henry Henderson." His smile could have melted the snow for miles around. Rising, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that promised warmth through even the coldest of winters. The news of their engagement spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. Reactions were mixed, as expected: congratulations from some, shocked disapproval from others. Mrs. Hempstead was overheard declaring that Henry Henderson must have taken leave of his senses. The banker's wife wondered aloud if the Henderson family would disown their eldest son for such an unsuitable match. To everyone's surprise, however, Mrs. Henderson herself put an end to such speculation by visiting the general store specifically to announce her delight in her son's choice of bride. "Tabitha is exactly what our family needs," she declared, loud enough for all to hear. "A woman of substance and character, who isn't afraid of hard work. Why, she reminds me of myself when Mr. Henderson courted me, though I dare say she's considerably prettier." With the matriarch of the Henderson family firmly in Tabitha's corner, the more vicious gossip began to subside, though it never disappeared entirely. Some wounds ran too deep, some prejudices too ingrained, to be easily overcome. December brought preparations not just for Christmas, but for a wedding. Tabitha, who had never imagined herself as a bride, found herself swept up in plans and traditions. Mrs. Henderson insisted that the ceremony take place at the ranch house, decorated for the season with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. "But perhaps you'd prefer the spring," she said one afternoon as they sorted through patterns for a wedding dress. "When the wildflowers are in bloom." Tabitha shook her head. "Winter suits us," she replied with certainty. "We've both weathered our share of storms. It seems fitting to begin our life together in a season that reminds us of resilience. Mrs. Henderson smiled, patting Tabitha's hand. You're good for my son, you know. He needs someone who understands that life isn't always easy, but it's the difficult seasons that make the good ones sweeter. The week before Christmas, as snow blanketed the countryside in hushed white, Tabitha Winters became Tabitha Henderson in a ceremony attended by more people than she would have thought possible. The Henderson ranch house overflowed with guests, not just family and close friends, but many from town who had gradually come to accept, if not fully embrace, the unlikely couple. Tabitha wore a dress of ivory satin, simple but elegant, with Mrs. Henderson's lace veil. Henry stood tall and proud at the altar they'd created in the main parlor, his eyes never leaving Tabitha as she walked toward him on Mr. Henderson's arm. "Who gives this woman to be married?" the minister asked. Mr. Henderson, standing straighter than he had in months, answered clearly, "Her family does." The simple words, acknowledging Tabitha as already part of their family, brought tears to her eyes. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When Henry slipped the pearl ring onto Tabitha's finger permanently, his hands were steady, his voice unwavering as he repeated his vows. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, holding her gaze, "and pledge my life and love to you, from this day forward." Tabitha's own voice trembled slightly as she placed a plain gold band on Henry's finger, binding him to her as surely as she was bound to him. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of all the days to come. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and music and dancing. Even Mrs. Hempstead, who had received an invitation more out of courtesy than expectation, appeared briefly to offer stiff congratulations before departing. As midnight approached, Henry led Tabitha outside onto the porch, where they could steal a moment alone beneath the stars. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close against the cold. Tabitha nodded, unable to find words adequate to express the fullness in her heart. For so long, she had defined herself by what she lacked: family, respectability, acceptance. Now, wrapped in the arms of a man who loved her exactly as she was, she understood that she had never been lacking at all. "They called me too dirty for a bride," she said softly, "but you saw beyond that." Henry tilted her face up to his. "I saw you," he corrected. "Just you, Tabitha. Strong and beautiful and more worthy of love than anyone I've ever known." Their kiss, witnessed only by the winter moon, sealed a bond that had begun with a broken fence and a wayward goat, and would endure through all the seasons of their lives together. Spring came to Colorado with its usual fickleness: warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, new grass pushing through melting drifts, creeks swollen with runoff from the mountains. For Tabitha, now settled into life as Mrs. Henry Henderson, the changing season brought both challenges and joys. She and Henry had decided to maintain both properties, the Circle H Ranch and Tabitha's smaller homestead. They made their primary home at the ranch, where Henry could best manage the growing herd of cattle, but Tabitha insisted on continuing to work her own land as well. "Your wife is the stubbornest woman I've ever met," Mr. Henderson commented to his son one evening as they watched Tabitha return from a day spent planting her vegetable garden. "Except perhaps your mother." Henry laughed. "I consider it one of her finest qualities." Indeed, Tabitha's determination proved valuable as she navigated her new role. Some of the ranch hands had initially been skeptical of their boss's choice in a wife, but her willingness to work alongside them mending tack, tending injured animals, even helping with the spring branding gradually earned their respect. In town, too, perceptions were slowly shifting. Tabitha still encountered the occasional cold shoulder or whispered comment, but increasingly, she was greeted with genuine warmth by many. The quilting circle she joined became a source of unexpected friendship. The articles she contributed to the local newspaper on gardening and small animal husbandry were well received, with several readers writing to express their appreciation for her practical advice. One bright May morning, as Tabitha sat on the porch shelling peas, a wagon approached the ranch house. To her surprise, it contained Mrs. Hempstead and her daughter, Charlotte, who was expecting her first child. "Mrs. Henderson," Mrs. Hempstead said stiffly as she helped her daughter down from the wagon. "I hope we're not intruding." Tabitha set aside her work and rose to greet them. "Not at all. Please come in." Charlotte, looking pale and anxious, managed a small smile. "I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Henderson. Mother said you might be willing to share your recipe for the tonic you make for expectant mothers." Dr. Wilson mentioned it helped his wife considerably during her difficult time. Tabitha glanced at Mrs. Hempstead, whose expression remained carefully neutral, then back to Charlotte. "Of course. I'd be happy to. It's quite simple to prepare." She led them inside, where she served tea and biscuits before retrieving her notebook of medicinal recipes, a collection she'd begun at the orphanage and expanded over the years with knowledge gleaned from books and the wisdom of older women. As she explained the preparation of the tonic, a blend of red raspberry leaf, nettle, and mint, steeped in honey water, she noticed Mrs. Hempstead examining the ranch house parlor, taking in the comfortable mix of Henderson family heirlooms and Tabitha's own simpler possessions. "Your home is lovely," the older woman said finally, surprising Tabitha with what seemed like genuine approval. "You've maintained tradition while adding your own touch." "Thank you," Tabitha replied, uncertain how to receive this unexpected olive branch. "Mrs. Henderson, my mother-in-law, has been very generous in encouraging me to make changes where I see fit." Mrs. Hempstead nodded, a shadow crossing her face. Eliza Henderson was always a sensible woman. I may have been hasty in my judgment of her son's choice." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Mrs. Hempstead, it was remarkable concession. Tabitha acknowledged it with a nod of her own, then turned her attention back to Charlotte, providing detailed instructions for the tonic and additional advice for easing the discomforts of pregnancy. When the Hempstead women departed an hour later, Tabitha stood on the porch watching their wagon recede into the distance, a strange sense of vindication warming her chest. She was still standing there when Henry returned from checking the cattle in the north pasture. "Was that the Hempstead wagon I passed on the road?" he asked, dismounting and joining her on the porch. Tabitha nodded. "Charlotte is expecting. They came for my tonic recipe." Henry's eyebrows rose. "Did they indeed? And did Mrs. Hempstead manage to refrain from commenting on your suitability as a source of maternal wisdom?" "She said our home is lovely," Tabitha replied, still somewhat bemused by the encounter. "And that your mother is sensible." Henry laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "High praise indeed from the arbiter of Redemption Creek society. Perhaps there's hope for her yet." Tabitha leaned into his warmth, grateful beyond words for the man who had seen value in her when others saw only dirt and disrepute. "People can change," she mused. "Or, at least, they can learn to see differently." "Some can," Henry agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Others require more convincing. But you, my love, are making believers of them all, one tonic recipe at a time." The summer passed in a blur of activity. The cattle herd thrived under Henry's management, while Tabitha's garden yielded a bounty that kept the ranch house larder well stocked and provided surplus to share with neighbors and those in need. Mr. Henderson's health improved enough that he could sit on the porch most days, offering advice and stories to anyone who would listen. In August, as the prairie grasses turned golden beneath the relentless sun, Tabitha made a discovery that changed everything. She had been feeling unusually tired, her appetite unpredictable, her emotions more volatile than usual. One morning, as she helped Mrs. Henderson preserve peaches, a wave of nausea overtook her, so suddenly she had to rush outside. Mrs. Henderson followed, concern etched on her face. "Tabitha, dear, how long has this been happening?" "A few weeks," Tabitha admitted, accepting the damp cloth her mother-in-law offered. I thought perhaps it was the summer heat. A slow smile spread across Mrs. Henderson's face. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. Something that tends to arrive about 9 months after a wedding. Tabitha's hand went instinctively to her stomach, her eyes widening. You think? Mrs. Henderson nodded. I had the same symptoms with all 3 of my children. We should send for Dr. Wilson to be certain, but I'd wager my best china that you're carrying the next generation of Hendersons. The doctor confirmed Mrs. Henderson's suspicion later that week. Tabitha was indeed with child, due to arrive sometime in early spring. When she told Henry that evening, as they sat watching the sunset from their porch, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. A baby, he said, his voice filled with wonder as he placed his hand over hers on her still, flat stomach. Our baby. Tabitha nodded, her own emotions too complex for words. Joy, certainly, but also fear born of her own motherless state, her lack of family history to guide her. Henry, perceptive as always, seemed to read her thoughts. You're going to be an extraordinary mother, he said softly. You have so much love to give, Tabitha. And you won't be doing it alone. You have me, my parents, this whole community that's finally beginning to see what I've always known. And what's that? She asked, needing to hear it. That you're the heart of this place now, Henry replied simply. The heart of this family. The heart of me. News of Tabitha's pregnancy spread quickly through Redemption Creek, met with the expected mix of reactions. Most offered genuine congratulations. A few expressed surprise that the Henderson line would continue through such an unlikely source. The quilting circle immediately began planning a baby blanket. Dr. Wilson's wife organized a gathering where the women of the town would bring gifts for mother and child. To Tabitha's astonishment, Mrs. Hempstead appeared at this gathering with not only her daughter, but a beautifully carved wooden cradle that had been in her family for generations. Charlotte has her grandmother's cradle already, she explained somewhat stiffly as she presented it to Tabitha. This one has simply been gathering dust in our attic. It seems sensible that it should be used. Tabitha accepted the gift with appropriate gratitude, recognizing it for what it was, not just a practical item but a symbolic gesture of acceptance into the community she had lived alongside but never truly been part of. As autumn painted the countryside in rich hues of amber and crimson, Tabitha's body changed to accommodate the new life growing within. Her dresses had to be let out, her pace slowed by the additional weight and the precautions both Henry and Dr. Wilson insisted upon. You're carrying precious cargo, Henry would remind her when she chafed at being prevented from more strenuous tasks. The chickens can manage without you for a season. December arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. 1 year after their wedding, Tabitha and Henry celebrated not only their anniversary, but the promise of the family they were creating together. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in the ranch house parlor, Henry presented Tabitha with a gifted journal bound in soft leather. For our child, he explained as she ran her fingers over the cover. So they'll know their mother's story, how she came to this land alone and built a life through courage and hard work. How she won the heart of a stubborn rancher and changed an entire town's perception through nothing more than being herself. Tears filled Tabitha's eyes. You think they'll be proud of such a story? A mother who was once called too dirty to be anyone's bride. Henry took her face in his hands, his expression fierce with love and conviction. They will know that their mother was the strongest, bravest woman in the Colorado Territory. That she never surrendered her dignity even when others tried to strip it from her. That she was as worthy of more respect than anyone I've ever known. He pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. And they'll know that their father put a ring on their mother's finger with more pride than he's ever felt about anything in his life. Winter deepened, trapping them often at the ranch house as blizzards raged across the plains. Tabitha used the enforced idleness to prepare for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny garments, recording family recipes in a book to be passed down, and, as Henry had suggested, beginning to write her story in the leather-bound journal. It wasn't always easy to revisit the painful parts of her past: the orphanage with its strict rules and colder comforts, the journey west with its dangers and loneliness, the early years in Redemption Creek, when every trip to town had been an exercise in holding her head high despite the whispers and stares. Yet as she wrote, Tabitha found herself focusing not on the hardships, but on the strength they had helped her develop, the resilience that had prepared her for the life she now cherished. March arrived with its characteristic unpredictability: warm days that hinted at spring, followed by fierce storms that reminded all that winter wasn't yet finished with the land. Tabitha's time grew near, her body heavy with child, her movements increasingly restricted. Dr. Wilson had taken to stopping by the ranch every few days, ostensibly to check on Mr. Henderson but primarily to monitor Tabitha's condition. First babies often take their time, he reassured her during one such visit. But everything appears to be progressing normally. The doctor had barely departed when Tabitha felt the first sharp pain, a tightening across her abdomen, unlike the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She gripped the back of a chair, breathing through it as Mrs. Henderson had taught her. When it passed, she moved carefully to the kitchen, where her mother-in-law was preparing supper. "I think," Tabitha said calmly, "that it might be time to send for Dr. Wilson again." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy. "At last. Henry's out checking the south pasture. I'll send one of the hands for him and another for the doctor." What followed was a night that seemed to stretch into eternity. Tabitha's labor progressed steadily but slowly, each contraction building on the last, each hour bringing her closer to meeting the child she already loved beyond reason. Henry remained by her side throughout, his steady presence anchoring her through the pain and fear. As dawn broke across the eastern plains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, Tabitha Henderson gave birth to a daughter, a perfect, red-faced, squalling miracle with a dusting of copper hair that matched her mother's. "She's beautiful," Henry whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as Dr. Wilson placed the swaddled infant in Tabitha's arms. "Just like her mother." Exhausted but exultant, Tabitha gazed down at her daughter's tiny features. "Hello, Hope," she said softly, the name they had chosen weeks before suddenly feeling more right than ever. "Welcome to the world." In the days that followed, visitors came to the Henderson ranch bearing gifts and good wishes for the newest member of the family. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson doted on their first grandchild with unabashed delight. The ranch hands, those rough men who had once viewed Tabitha with suspicion, became unexpectedly gentle in the presence of the baby, bringing hand-carved toys and offering awkward but sincere congratulations. Even Mrs. Hempstead made an appearance, arriving with Charlotte and her own infant son. As the two mothers sat comparing notes on feeding schedules and sleep patterns, Tabitha marveled at how life could change. How the woman who had once called her too dirty for a bride now sat in her parlor, admiring her child. Spring came in earnest, melting the snow and bringing new growth to the land. On a warm April afternoon, Henry found Tabitha sitting on the porch of her original homestead, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. He had helped her restore the cabin, which they now used as a retreat from the busier life at the main ranch house. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the porch swing. Tabitha smiled, leaning into his solid warmth. "Just remembering. It was almost 2 years ago that you brought back my wayward goat and offered to fix my fence." Henry chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Best decision I ever made. Though I had no idea then where it would lead." "Did you not?" Tabitha asked, glancing up at him. "You seemed very sure of yourself that day." "I was sure there was something special about the copper-haired woman who insisted she could manage her own repairs," Henry admitted. But I couldn't have imagined all this you as my wife, our daughter in your arms, the future stretching out before us like the prairie in springtime. Tabitha gazed out at that future, the land they shared, the home they had built together, the child who represented all their hopes and dreams. In her mind, she could still hear the whispers that had followed her for so long, too wild, too common, too dirty for a bride. But those voices were fading now, replaced by others: beloved wife, cherished mother, respected neighbor. They were wrong about me, she said softly, not with bitterness, but with the simple confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. All of them who thought I wasn't good enough. Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. They were blind, he corrected, but some have learned to see. And those who haven't. He shrugged. Their loss. Hope stirred in Tabitha's arms, her tiny face scrunching briefly before relaxing back into sleep. Tabitha pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent that had become her favorite in all the world. I used to think that proving them wrong was important, she mused, showing the town that I was worthy of respect despite my background. But now I understand that it was never about them at all. It was about being true to myself, about building a life that I could be proud of, regardless of what anyone else thought. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. And have you built a life you're proud of? Tabitha looked up at the man who had seen her true self from the beginning, who had put a ring on her finger with pride when others called her too dirty for a bride. She thought of their daughter, who would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved. She thought of the land they tended together, the community that had gradually opened its arms to include her, the future that stretched before them, rich with possibility. Yes, she said simply, her heart full beyond measure. More than I ever dreamed possible. As the afternoon sun bathed the Colorado prairie in golden light, Henry Henderson bent to kiss his wife, their sleeping daughter nestled between them, a family forged not from conventional expectations, but from love that had seen beyond prejudice to the truth of what truly mattered. And in that moment, on the porch of the cabin where her western journey had truly begun, Tabitha knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not despite her past, but because of it, because every hardship and struggle had led her here, to this man, this child, this life that was hers to cherish and protect and celebrate. They had called her too dirty for a bride, but Henry Henderson had put a ring on her finger with pride. And in doing so, he had helped her discover what she had perhaps known all along, that true worth was never determined by the judgments of others, but by the strength of one's own heart and the courage to live authentically despite them. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Tabitha Henderson looked out at the land she loved, held the family she had created, and knew herself to be the richest woman in all the Colorado territory, not in gold or silver or social standing, but in the currency that mattered most: love given and received without reservation, a life built on honesty and hard work, and the knowledge that she had finally, truly come home.